and greening harmful subsidies. This is part of a series of webinars that the Biodiversity Finance Initiative organized to get deeper on the challenges, opportunities, and structures of different finance solutions that will be helpful and contribute to reduce the current gap in financing for biodiversity. Today we have a distinguished panel, and the webinar is organized in cooperation with the GIZ and OECD. Let me first go you through our short agenda, introduce the speakers, and then follow with the first presentation. The speakers of today, we are very welcome to invite to provide their knowledge and expertise on the topic of reforming subsidies are Eike Meyer from GIZ. Eike is an advisor working for the Environmental Policy and Sustainable Development Program of GIZ. His work focuses on environmental fiscal reform and related policies and practices. Before taking up this assignment with the GIZ, Eike worked with the Green Budget Germany think tank and was at the same time interim director of the Green Budget Europe. Eike will start the lineup of presentations on greening and reforming harmful subsidies to biodiversity, and will elaborate on the current trends, some experiences from countries and from GIZ cooperation on how the challenges to overcoming the reforms of those fiscal measures are studied and put in practice. The second speaker will be Katia Kauruzakis from the OECD, and she will introduce two other colleagues working on specific aspects on subsidies, and with particular reference to agriculture and fisheries. Katia leads the biodiversity work at the OECD Environment Directorate. The issues covered under her responsibility include the economics of biodiversity and ecosystem services, the design and implementation of effective policy instruments for biodiversity conservation and sustainable use, as long as other work and research under the financing for biodiversity topics, work on indicators, and other aspects related to financial mechanisms. Prior to taking up this responsibility, she worked at the OECD EIA Climate Change Expert Group, and with previous experience as well as with the US Environmental Protection Agency. Her presentation providing most recent insights from OECD Research Powerhouse on practices and numbers related to harmful subsidies, how to calculate them, how to assess them, and how to possibly identify policy measures. Her presentation will be enriched by contribution from two senior experts in OECD that are working on particular sector subsidy areas. The first will be Dimitris Diakozavas, who is a senior economist in the Natural Resource and Policy Division of OECD in the Trade and Agriculture Directorate. He worked for the Directorate since 1989. Main areas of expertise include agricultural, trade, environmental policy, and the measurement and evaluation of agricultural policies. Dimitri is currently engaged and in charge of the work on green growth and agriculture. He also contributes to the OECD Agricultural Policy Monitoring and Evaluation reports. The last speaker in this distinguished panel will be Roger Martini, who is a senior analyst in OECD Fisheries Group. The Fisheries Group mandate and work areas include policy in support of the fisheries sector around the world and the use of data to develop recommendations on how government can advance their policy objectives without contributing to overcapacity, overfishing, and illegal fishing. He has been involved in policy measurement and related work for more than 15 years and was previously a policy analyst working with the government of Canada. Today, presentations will therefore get deeper on one of the most challenging finance solutions to reduce the pressure on biodiversity and also helping saving and reallocate scarce public resources for better use. It's important that we do also have several colleagues working in the field from the BIOFIN different teams and beyond that will enrich the discussion. The agenda of this webinar will start with the presentation with Eike, followed by the presentation with our OECD colleagues. There will then be about 30 minutes allowed for questions and answers. Before we give the mic and starting the speaking to Eike, let me just remind a few housekeeping rules. This is a webinar with several participants. We have about 50 participants now, and we are currently muting every single participant to allow better volume and sound. You have several ways to participate to the webinar. Please, at any time during the webinar, you can write questions in the chat below, and then we will give you, as moderators, the opportunity to ask the questions, or we read the question aloud if this is your preference. The second option is to raise your hand. You will have this option as part of the GoToWebinar interface, and when we will see your hands raised, we will give you in order the opportunity to speak. I hope you will enjoy this webinar. We thank again GIZ and OECD for helping us to address this very challenging but rich of opportunities finance solution. Without further ado, give the word to Eike Meyer for his presentation that you already see on your screen. Eike, the word is to you. Thank you.
Yes, hello. Thank you very much, Max. Thank you very much to UNDP BIOFIN for organizing this webinar and for giving me the chance to speak here. Yeah, I would like to ask the question if everybody can hear me, but I guess that doesn't make any sense. I think somebody will intervene and it doesn't work. So to get started, to start with an sorry, I have a technical question. If I want to move to the next slide, now it works. Sorry. So, as an introduction, why do we talk about subsidy reform, or I would like to take it broader, pricing reform, fiscal reforms in the context of biodiversity conservation? There's two dimensions in which basically subsidy reform and wider pricing reform is relevant to biodiversity conservation, and they're actually inscribed in the political framework that we have for biodiversity conservation at the moment, in the Aichi biodiversity targets of the strategic plan until 2020. One is in target 3, which stipulates that all incentives harmful to biodiversity, and those incentives should include subsidies, are supposed to be eliminated or phased out or reformed until 2020 in order to create the right framework conditions and to end incentives for the overuse of resources and other harmful drivers of biodiversity loss until 2020. That is the dimension of creating the right frameworks, the right incentives for biodiversity conservation. And the other is the revenue mobilization dimension, which is enshrined in the Aichi biodiversity targets in target 20, which stipulates that by 2020 the signatory governments are required to provide the necessary financial resources to implement the strategic plan, the other targets of the strategic plans. So yeah, we have these two dimensions of subsidy reform which are relevant to biodiversity conservation. And to go a little bit deeper, or very generally, into the one dimension, the incentives dimension, the framework dimension, and just take one step back and ask the question, why, what is it actually, why do we have to worry about incentives for environmentally, for environmental protection and biodiversity conservation? I would say we're pretty used in our markets, in our current life, that environmentally friendly products, sustainably produced products, or production practices are cheaper, are more expensive than environmentally unsound or unsustainable production and consumption practices. I think the most common example is that renewable energies, it is changing right now, but for a long time and still today, are usually the more expensive alternative in comparison to producing electricity from coal, which has a much larger impact not only on climate but also on biodiversity. Well, two other examples that you see here on the slide is the comparison of short distance air travel in comparison to train rides, and the comparison of the price of meat from intensive farming in comparison with meat products from organic farming or from extensive farming. I think you can probably think of many different examples. Also, they are, of course, very dependent on the national or the economic context of different regions in the world and in individual countries. But as a general rule, we are kind of used to this fact that environmentally soundly produced, sustainable products are more expensive. However, this is definitely not according to any law of nature, but rather to the framework conditions that we have in our markets today. And these framework conditions are characterized to a large extent by two great market failures or interventions in the market. One being the fact that a lot of costs which actually are incurred on the environment or on other people are externalized and not borne by the producer or by the consumer of specific products. For example, the cost of climate change is usually not borne by the operator of a CO2 of a coal power plant, but rather by neighboring communities, or if you think of climate change, by the world society as a whole. And similarly, or as a second market failure or intervention of the market, which shifts the price incentives towards unsustainable practices, are environmentally harmful subsidies, which are in the focus of the webinar today, which actually give government support, which is a state intervention on behalf of unsustainable production and consumption practices, which makes them cheaper in comparison to sustainable practices. So the idea of pricing reform, of green fiscal reform, subsidy reform, environmental taxes, is to remedy these market failures, on the one hand by internalizing external costs through environmental taxes, for example, CO2 taxes, internalizing, or at least going in the direction of internalizing the social cost, the external cost of CO2 emissions and other pollutant emissions, and on the other hand by reforming harmful subsidies. So that, and yes, the animation works, in the end we create a level playing field and create better incentives for environmentally sound production and consumption patterns, and make them more often competitive and on free functioning markets. This slide, we don't have to go through that, or I will not go through that in detail, but is to show that while I'm focusing mostly in this presentation on pricing reform, subsidy reform, tax reform in the energy sector, that this approach of green fiscal reform is actually pertinent to all sectors. And actually many of these sectors in this context, since this webinar is mainly focused on biodiversity, are maybe more close to the area of work or to the heart of many people who are listening. So also in agriculture, forestry and fisheries, and definitely also in industry and transportation, on the one hand internalizing externalities through environmental taxes, and on the other side identifying and eliminating or phasing out harmful subsidies is also relevant. Going into the discussion on harmful subsidies a bit deeper, although I think colleagues from OECD may come back to this as well. What is actually a subsidy is a question of definition, and is definitely not a one that is always answered very clearly. Depending on who you talk to, or depending on who you talk to, you will have different definitions of a subsidy, which includes different dimensions of government intervention. I think the general definition of a subsidy is that it is a government intervention which confers a benefit to a particular group of economic actors and not to others. The type of intervention that we most commonly consider of as a subsidy is, of course, a direct financial transfer from the government to a particular group of actors. In the energy sector, for example, as a direct price subsidy to the sale of black coal in national markets in order to make them competitive on international markets. In the area of agriculture, you could think of fertilizer subsidies to make fertilizers more cheaper and more competitive. Then on the way other end, if you take the broadest scope of definitions of subsidies, it includes basically all government interventions which result in non-full cost pricing and in a product price or a production price which does not include the full externalities, which does not include infrastructure or risks which are borne by the government, or which allows for the producer not to pay full taxes. So indirect budget transfers are mainly tax exemptions from taxes that other producers have to pay, which is very typically in industry, for example, which are in many countries relieved from energy taxes or pay very low energy tax rates. And in the area of risk transfers or induced transfers, there's ample examples in different sectors through the provision of infrastructure or through the covering of risk on the government behalf from the government. So depending on who you talk to, what is actually a subsidy is something very different. And of course, that is also true if you think of what is actually a harmful subsidy and what is not. Yeah, coming now to the barriers of reform, which was supposed to be the main focus of my presentation. There's 5 political barriers that I would like to touch upon here. One is that there is often or usually a great lack of transparency. Subsidies is something you can usually not look easily up and download a list of harmful subsidies in a particular country that you could approach to reform. Then it is usually not even, in most countries, not even direct budget transfers are really made transparent by governments. There are some exemptions. Germany, for example, does have a report by government to the parliament every 2 years on its subsidies in general, not necessarily evaluated for their environmental harmfulness or not. But then this is limited to direct budget transfers or to tax expenditures, but it does not include further the broader scope of subsidies. So there's actually a big need for non-governmental organizations or also intergovernmental organizations to analyze and to identify harmful subsidies. Then, of course, there is distributional concerns. Subsidies are, or the reform of subsidies is often considered to be something harmful or something unsocial, something that is harming lower income groups, and we'll come back to that in a second. Third, there is competitiveness concerns. Subsidies are usually introduced with the aim of helping certain industries and maintaining their competitiveness in international competition. So the phase-out or the reform of subsidies, harmful or not, is of course met with the fear of these sectors or of these industries to lose their international competitiveness. And then As a fourth, the two prior ones, or maybe the three prior ones, are aggravated by the fact that there is usually a strong vested interest in the maintaining of subsidies. Sectors that are benefiting, or companies that are benefiting from specific subsidies, are usually very aware of the fact that they are dependent, or that they are benefiting from the subsidies, whereas other sectors or companies which are not benefiting are less aware of the fact that they are not benefiting. So there is usually a strong opposition, of course, from beneficiaries. And finally, there is also a lot of examples of false perceptions or fears of change. Consumers mostly, but also producers, are used to certain cost structures and to certain costs of particular products, mainly energy, or also take water. If the cost of these products or of these were to change, then this would be noticed very easily, whereas maybe other changes, positive changes elsewhere in the economy or in the prices of other products, would be less noted. To take on the second and the third, distributional concerns and competitiveness concerns, a little bit more in detail. First, distributional concerns. If we think about reforming subsidies, I think the two headlines here are two headlines that we would think of quite easily. The first is actually just from the beginning of this year, where in Mexico the government phased out fuel subsidies over the turn of the year, which resulted in street protests in some parts of Mexico. And the other headline, also being quite a typical one that we read every once in a while, is that the industry is complaining about high energy prices. I think you can easily also think of farmers here thinking about complaining about higher fuel prices or higher fertilizer prices, etc. Now, if we look behind that, if we look behind what is actually the effect of the reform of subsidies, the picture is much more differentiated. For example, the distributional effects of subsidy reform, especially in energy, but also for other resources, is in fact not regressive. It is not benefiting higher income groups more than lower income groups, but it's quite the opposite. In many countries, especially energy consumption, or the middle and upper income classes consume much more energy than lower income classes, which means that if energy, if fuel or electricity is subsidized, actually middle and upper income groups benefit from it much more. This graph here shows the distribution of expenditure on gasoline exactly in Mexico, where we had just seen the headline from that a street protest erupted when the subsidy was abolished. So actually, the reality behind subsidy reform is that it does, in fact, is not only an environmentally sensible reform, but it is also a socially sensible reform to reduce the subsidies. Of course, this is different from product to product, or from resource to resource, and from country to country, but it's definitely also always necessary to look at the distributional effects of a particular subsidy or tax on a particular resource in a particular country. Of course, for lower income groups, even if as a percentage they spend less on energy in this example than upper income groups, the absolute change for them will be less easy to cope with. But then it is not only about reforming or reducing the subsidy, but also about using the revenue from the subsidy. And with a small proportion of the revenue from the phase out or from the reform of the subsidy, targeted measures can be financed to that actually benefit lower income groups directly, instead of subsidizing a environmentally harmful product, energy or water or other resources, on the broad scale. Then looking at competitiveness, of course, rising prices for inputs or for other resources used in production will mean for particular countries that, for particular companies that are heavily dependent on the or use this resource very intensively, that they will have higher production costs and will potentially lose their competitiveness or become less competitive. But this doesn't go through the board. There is those companies in one economy that are more resource efficient will benefit, whereas companies that are less resource efficient will actually lose competitiveness, which is an intention of the reform in the first place, because it is supposed to create incentives for resource efficiency. And again, similar to the distributional effects of subsidies, it is important not only to look at the incentives that are created, but also at the revenues that are created. Those companies that are negatively affected in their competitiveness, well, it is possible to design programs or support schemes or exemptions for those companies which are heavily affected by rising resource prices in order to ease their path of adaptation or to ease the path of transition away from these companies for workers and for moderating the structural change in these regions. That is a very broad take at a very complicated and detailed subject, how the competitiveness of different sectors is affected. But to show that it is certainly not true that rising energy or other resource prices hurt the economy as a whole, this graph here, which you have been looking at for a while now, is showing the effects of environmental tax reforms in Europe, in different countries of Europe, from the late 90s to the 2000s on GDP. And it is in comparison to a business as usual scenario. All these environmental tax reforms included rising energy prices, but they also included using the revenue for mainly lowering income taxation, so prices for labor, and also the revenue was used in some countries for financing technological development or assistance programs for industry sectors to adapt. And as you can see in all of these countries, at least over the long run, and in some even over the short run, the effects of the reform of subsidies and the increase of energy prices through taxation has actually had positive effects on GDP growth. So, coming out of this, we have looked at barriers against reform, and we have looked into competitiveness concerns and distributional concerns a little bit more in detail. What are takeaway messages, or what are experiences or general rules how to overcome or how to approach these barriers and how to possibly overcome them? One, to overcome the fact that there is strong vested interests in particular reform, a fair thing to say is that in order to successfully reform harmful subsidies, strong political will on the part of the government is certainly something that is helpful, because it is a reform that creates winners and losers, and it is difficult to create win-win situations for everybody in such a reform process. So strong political will is something that is certainly necessary. The second aspect of that is helpful, or a good strategy, to create a coalition of winners and to actually make the winners of the reform of harmful subsidies heard. Usually those who lose from a subsidy reform are much more aware of the fact that the reform is hurting them, because their production costs or their price of fuel at the pump or their water bill increases. But the winners of reform, which always exist because it's a redistribution of prices and income, the winners are usually much less aware of it. That is smaller, more labor-intensive industries, for example, who don't necessarily notice their improved competitiveness against more resource-intensive companies. And it is also those in the population who benefit from increased spending, which the government is capable of delivering because of reduced subsidies or increased environmental taxation. So usually the winners feel the effects much more indirectly than the losers. So for a government which wants to be successful with the reform of helpful subsidies, making the winners aware and informing them of their benefit is an important part of the strategy. Then I mentioned lack of transparency as one big barrier against reform, because subsidies are usually well, they're not easily visible. Here, a first step is certainly to create inventories on behalf of the governments. Governments could report more on subsidies and actually monitor their own expenditure in terms of its what constitutes a subsidy and what not, and second, what is actually a harmful subsidy. But certainly this analysis will have to come to a big extent from intergovernmental organizations and non-governmental organizations, and actually especially the OECD, also the World Bank, the IMF, IASD, the Global Subsidies Initiative, and many other organizations are already doing quite an important job exactly there to increase transparency and to identify subsidies, to analyze the effects of subsidies, so to be able to make recommendations for their reform. Both for competitiveness concerns and distributional concerns, sound impact assessment is something very important. Taking you through these very generally through the distributional and the competitiveness effects of pricing reform in very general, one point that I wanted to make is that it depends on the particular situation and the effects on different parts of the society, different income groups and different sectors, different types of companies are always very different. It is hard to make any generalizations, and it's very important to know what parts of society and what parts of the economy will be affected by a subsidy reform directly and indirectly, in order to be able to design a sound transition existence, sound compensation schemes, and maybe also exemptions for parts of society or of the economy which are affected in a way that is not wanted. For competitiveness, part of the strategy to overcome barriers is certainly to take affected companies, or you could also think of farmers, by the hand and to support either technological adaptation or a transition away from inefficient business models. And it's, yes, as I already mentioned, also an important part of a strategy to identify those sectors in an economy which will not be able to adjust quickly and to exempt them or give them reduced tax rates, or to have a very slow phase-out trajectory of the subsidy for these sectors. Then for distributional concerns, a very important part of the strategy is to be able to give targeted compensation to low-income groups in society, so that if energy or water or food prices or prices of other basic consumption goods rise, they are able to compensate for this rising price by receiving social security, targeted direct social security benefits. Of course, it is a challenge if the infrastructure for social security payments is not there, but to find a way to target low-income groups with direct cash transfer, ideally, is part of a successful strategy. And then there is the last barrier to reform, false perceptions and fears of change. And here it is certainly necessary for a government, or also for other supporting organizations who want to support the reform of harmful subsidies, to proactively inform, because there are misconceptions, and because the direct negative effect, the higher prices for certain products, are more easily felt than the benefits, be it through increased government spending in other parts, or be it through an improved environment. These effects are usually, since they are more indirect, more difficult to grasp for the wider public. And even though it is somehow simplistic to say, it is very important in a successful reform strategy for harmful subsidies to educate and to inform about the objectives and the intended effects and the inevitable side effects and the strategies to overcome the side effects on behalf of the government. This slide is taken from an IMF presentation, which it reiterates many of the things that I have named before. It's ingredients of a successful reform strategy for energy subsidies in this case, it confirms some of the bullet points on the slide before, that it is important to have a comprehensive reform plan which clearly states the objectives, which also has a timetable, because subsidies are usually not, it's usually not smart to reduce subsidies overnight or over a short term, but to rather have them phase out slowly in order to give both consumers but also mainly producers who have to invest in new capital, new technology, a long time to adjust. It's important to specify what the revenue is supposed to be used for, and to also analyze what the distributional effects of the revenue use are, to consult with stakeholders. Then second, protecting low-income households, as I mentioned earlier, ideally through targeted measures like cash transfer if possible. Usually the protection of low-income households against rising prices will take up only a very small proportion of the revenue that is saved, or the revenue from increased taxes. And for the industry to have a proactive strategy in place to insist the transition away from uneconomic production practices. Now, to only very briefly dip into two examples where something like this has actually happened. One is the introduction, one that I would like to mention and briefly describe, is the introduction of an environmental taxation framework law in Vietnam, which is in place since 2012 and which included mainly, that is the biggest chunk of it, taxes on gasoline, oil and coal, and also interestingly, although of course fiscally less relevant, taxes on harmful substances like hydrofluorocarbons, plastic bags, herbicides, pesticides, and other harmful substances. Now, this framework law is in place. The taxes have been collected already for 3 to 4 years. A first impact assessment is actually conducted by the Vietnamese government this year. We're looking forward to having them results. It is already among the emerging economies considered a successful example. And looking through the literature for success factors and making reference to the success factors that I mentioned in general earlier, one thing that was the case in Vietnam, and certainly that was a strong political will. Environmental tax reform was part of the green economy development strategy of the Vietnamese government, and there was a high-level political decision to go in that direction. Then, coming from this strong political will, Vietnam engaged in a very sound impact assessment. There were several studies conducted over the course of more than a year, and effects on different parts of the economy analyzed, and actually on that basis decisions taken which sectors or which type of companies to exempt from fuel taxes, which in the case of Vietnam was, for example, small-scale fishers, which would not have been able to accommodate higher prices for fuel unless they would have to go out of business. And one of the success factors in Vietnam, to be fair, was also the fact that the tax was introduced, the taxes were introduced at comparably low initial rates, which of course reduced political opposition in the beginning, and which of course doesn't make the pricing reform very, very environmentally effective in the first place. But once a tax is in place, it is more easy to increase, and actually the government now, after the review after 4 years of operation will go in that direction and introduce escalators for the prices. A second reform that I would briefly like to mention is the reform or the abolishment of gasoline subsidies in Indonesia. Indonesia came from a situation where a very high proportion of the fiscal budget, 20%, was actually allocated to gasoline subsidies, which after the economic crisis was no longer sustainable fiscally, so there was a high pressure to reduce. The two bars on the left that you see is the volume of the part of the state budget that was dedicated to fuel subsidies. The first gray bar in 2015, and then 2015, yes, and then the red bar next to it is the amount of the state budget that was dedicated to fuel subsidies 1 year later. In 2016, it was a reduction of 20% of the federal budget for subsidies to only 8%. And this comparatively, proportionally very large amount of revenue that was, or of financial resources in the in the federal budget that was saved, was reallocated partly to improving the social safety net, direct cash transfer programs, and to widen their coverage to include also broader parts of the poor population. And it was used to upgrade infrastructure. It was reallocated to spending programs for physical infrastructure investment, but also in health and education. And the distributional effects of this whole shifting from subsidies to other government spending actually had a very pro-poor, progressive distributional effect, which made it politically very acceptable. So also here, looking at success factors, again, coming from a different angle, but there was strong political will, in this case simply because fiscal pressure was very high. The government needed to reduce its fuel subsidies because they were not fiscally sustainable. Also, like in Vietnam, in the case of Indonesia, the government spent a considerable amount of time on impact assessment and on modeling the effects of different scenarios for different trajectories of fuel reduction, different exceptions, and the impact of different sectors. And thirdly, targeted compensation measures, which try to redirect part of the saved revenue to spending programs which would directly benefit the poor population, and the pro-poor spending of revenues and the use of revenues to strongly invest in infrastructure and also in education and in health. And maybe fifth, which is not on the slide, to actually inform the public proactively that the investments in education and in health and in infrastructure, which they could see, which they will be able to see very soon, were only possible thanks to the reduced fuel subsidies. I leave it with that for the moment. I did not have a clock on my screen. I'm afraid I ran a bit over. I apologize for that.
Many thanks. I think you did it well. Even you took a bit of more time on what was allocated, but thank you for your presentation. Before we do some technical switch for our OECD colleagues, let me highlight a few points on your presentation. The first one is the need to collect evidence and produce new evidence, and we do hope that with our field presence and BIOFIN teams on the ground, we will collect additional information on the current subsidies that may be harmful to biodiversity, as well as possible options. The second one, a very important point, is about the myths that are around subsidy reforms, now, and likely there is evidence from a few cases that some of the counter-arguments are not strong, for example, that is against the poor, or that it increases inequality. Another important point that was made is the link with existing reforms and external triggers, like wider reforms in the public sector on environmental taxation, green taxation, and the extreme importance of external issues to the discussion, such as fiscal pressures, the cost and price of some of the resources that are related to, for example, oil, that are required in order to surpass some of the barriers that were highlighted. And it's good that the cases of Indonesia and Vietnam already show how some of the strategies that were mentioned can help to overcome those barriers. Without further ado, let me pass the word to Katia, who should be now ready to start the discussion. Please be aware of the time. I may intervene if you surpass of more than 3-4 minutes. Please go ahead, and Katia, with your presentation and the contribution of OECD colleagues. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you very much, both to Max and Marco and UNDP BIOFIN. Could I just, you do hear me, right? And you can see our screen?
Yes, please go ahead.
Wonderful. Okay, so I'm here with Dimitris and Roger. And what we will present to you today is insights on the reform and greening of environmentally harmful subsidies. And also we'll be highlighting the methods used at the OECD to measure government support to both agriculture and fisheries. So just very quickly, I'll go through context, highlight some country examples and the various relevant OECD databases, and then Dimitris will go through how we measure support to agriculture, and Roger will go through how to measure support for fisheries. We know about the HE Biodiversity Target 3 and incentives. I did a great job highlighting that context. Also, just to note that many of the national biodiversity and strategies have highlighted that there are no national targets for IHE Target 3 in across several of the NBSAPs. And ICA has also highlighted why this is important. Just to note, the issue of subsidies impacts on a number of different issues, economic, environmental, and social, both at domestic and at global level. So there's just a quick summary here. But let's look at the overall context in terms of the numbers as well. Here we have fossil fuel subsidy production consumption, at least 400 billion per year globally. This varies significantly in line with international energy prices. In terms of subsidies for water use and treatment, around 450 billion globally in 2012. Based on IMF information. Turning to agricultural production, around 100 billion years in support, of which, sorry, it's more than that, 100 billion is considered potentially environmentally harmful in OECD countries in 2015, and Dimitris will be talking about that afterwards. Fisheries, almost 7 billion for the OECD countries, and 35 billion estimated globally. A number of other subsidies in place as well. And when we compare these large numbers, 400 billion, 450 billion, 100 billion, 7 billion to 35 billion, what do we have for finance for biodiversity? According to estimates from a few years ago, so positive finance for biodiversity, estimated at around 50 billion a year. So major discrepancies here between subsidies for production and subsidies that are really good for sort of finance, rather, that's good for biodiversity. And this slide just lists here the various impacts of the subsidies and support highlighted from the previous slide in terms of impact. So fossil fuel production and consumption, subsidies lead to land degradation, methane emissions, carbon dioxide emissions, which then have indirect negative impacts on biodiversity as climate change affects negatively biodiversity. Water use and treatment encourages overuse and investment in unsustainable uses. Agriculture production and aquaculture can also lead to then subsidies and subsidies to habitat destruction, nutrient pollution, etc. So these are all the negative environmental impacts that are the sort of the potential environmental problems that are exacerbated by the different subsidies. Which leads us then to the need to identify, track, and reform what these subsidies are and how one might go about doing that. The various steps to reforming environmentally harmful subsidies are, first of all, admitting that certain subsidies might be causing problems. Very important is to have good information on the size and nature of the subsidies, and also, of course, the understanding of the effects of the subsidies and of their reform on economic, social, and environmental indicators. What we have at the OECD and what we'll be highlighting in a bit is information from both OECD and some non-OECD countries, so aggregate data. But what it would also be very nice is if there were more national examples of sort of national level studies that look at what types of environmentally harmful subsidies are in place and how these can be reformed. I have just highlighted here two examples of such national level studies. One is a French report that examined the public support harmful specific to biodiversity. And Germany also, I think in 2014, released a report on environmentally harmful subsidies in Germany. So here we have some examples on the reform and greening of environmentally harmful subsidies. Iceland undertook a substantial fisheries subsidy reform. New Zealand is a country that undertook both subsidy reform in the fisheries sector in the 1990s, predominantly in response to fiscal pressure, as well as agricultural subsidy reform in the 1980s. Other examples are listed here as well. Just to highlight, most recently, Switzerland has undertaken agricultural policy reform in its 2014 to 2017 agricultural policy, including to address biodiversity concerns. I'm not going to go through all of these in details. We've just also highlighted some of the references if there's interest to read up on some of the insights further. Mexico recently introduced an excise tax on pesticides in 2014, where the tax rates vary according to the acute toxicity level of the pesticides. France also has such a system in place as well for pesticide taxes. And just looking in terms of the numbers, again in Mexico, for example, the expected collection of this pesticides tax was approximately $14 million in 2014 and expected to rise to $30 million from 2015, given a phased approach that they've taken. So also illustrating how these types of incentive measures can provide incentives to reduce use and also generate revenue that can be used for general purposes or potentially can also be earmarked to then invest it back into biodiversity conservation and sustainable use. Brazil has a very interesting example on the use of ecological indicators, which are used to help allocate the revenue that they obtain from taxes on goods and services. And then actually the CBD has a nice overview document from 2011 that also highlights subsidy reform in India with regard to chemical fertilizers, and also in Indonesia where they removed pesticide subsidies. And yet, showing 3 years later after the subsidy reform that they still had record levels of rice production and savings of over $100 million. There's also recently some work we did on the political economy of biodiversity policy reform, so also looking at issues such as competitiveness issues, income distributional implications of policy reform, vested interests, etc. So the types of barriers that arise in effective biodiversity policy reform, and what types of insights and lessons can be learned from how to overcome these. With examples on new case studies rather on French tax on pesticides, the agriculture policy reform I already mentioned in Switzerland, EU payments under the Fisheries Partnership Agreement for marine conservation in Mauritania and Guinea-Bissau, and also in Iceland. I won't go through these here in the interest of time, but these are some of the lessons from across these 4 case studies that we looked at in terms of how to overcome the barriers and try and get to more effective and rapid policy reforms in the context of biodiversity. So just to then summarize quickly here before I pass on to Dimitris, we have a number of different OECD databases here that measure support across different sectors, including support to agriculture, support to fisheries. We haven't covered this at all in this presentation here, but the OECD also collects data across a number of countries on fossil fuel subsidies, so the data is available here, the link here, and also a database on policy instruments on the environment, which I'll just cover very quickly before I pass on the agricultural support, as it's also related to HE Target 3, not so much with regard to the reform of harmful subsidies, but about the positive incentives. That is the second element of HE Target 3. So what is the OECD database on policy instruments for the environment? It covers a number of instruments, including environmentally related taxes, fees and charges, tradable permit schemes, environmentally motivated subsidies, so the positive kind. There's data in this database on rather nearly 3,000 instruments covering 58 countries, so OECD plus around 25 other countries. And of course, all countries are welcome to provide information to this database. And all the policy instruments can be tagged by different environmental domains. We've just introduced a new tagging, a new domain rather, for biodiversity, which means that we've gone through all of the instruments and tagged the ones that are relevant for biodiversity. And just as information in the sense of what this has enabled us to do, if you look at, for example, based on the data in this PINE database, we see that we have information on the revenue from environmentally related taxes. You see here a number of OECD countries, but also a number of non-OECD countries. India's here, Indonesia, China, and a number of others. As I mentioned, it's 58 countries in total so far, but anyone is welcome to report to it. So we see here the relative revenue from environmentally related taxes, where the blue is from energy-related, environmentally related taxes, red is motor vehicles and transport, the green is other, and of that other, a fraction of that is biodiversity relevant. And so based on the data available in our database, we know that in 2015, I think, or 2014 rather, revenue from biodiversity relevant taxes, this only reflects OECD countries, although we have more information in the database, is 6 billion per year, which is actually a very small amount of the total revenue of environmentally relevant taxes. So there is potential to scale this up. And then, of course, if countries do raise their biodiversity relevant taxes, they can decide how to earmark that if they wish to do so, and use that for different environmental and or social purposes. So I'll stop here and I'll pass on to Dimitris, who will really get into the nuts and bolts of agricultural support.
Thank you, Katia. Good afternoon or good morning, depends where you are. Thank you very much for your invitation. On agricultural support, as you probably know, the OECD Secretariat has been estimated agricultural support for OECD and non-OECD, a number of non-OECD countries for over 30 years. And the OECD database is very rich. It contains long-time series. It uses consistent approach over time in countries. It provides detailed policy information covering 50 countries. It covers at the moment all OECD countries, although the EU as a whole, plus 9 non-OECD countries: Brazil, China, Colombia, Indonesia, Kazakhstan, Russia, South Africa, Ukraine, Vietnam. These 50 countries comprise around 90% of global value added in agriculture. The estimates are updated annually. Methodology is regularly reviewed to better reflect policy evolution. The data and the methodology are well documented, publicly available, they're very transparent, and despite the weaknesses, is accepted by the countries. It is a kind of, we can say that it's a kind of unique source for references. The methods allow us to distinguish between the various types of support that benefit the agricultural sector as a whole, but also the types of support which benefit the farmer side. For example, what do we say the producer support estimates measures? This measures the cost of support to the agricultural producers arising from policy measures that keep domestic prices above world prices and is paid by consumers, plus the budgetary payments, which is financed by taxpayers at the budget. In addition, we have data that refers to the monetary transfers to services provided collectively to the agricultural sector as a whole, what I call the general support estimates. And these measures include things like research and development, inspection, market infrastructure, and so on. In addition, the database includes information on the transfers from or to the consumers of agricultural commodities arising from policy measures. Now, here I will focus only on the measures of the producer support policies. And it can be argued that the way in which countries provide support to farmers is as important as the total level of support. Governments have a large portfolio of measures at their disposal, and it's important for policy evaluation to know how support is provided. For example, support might be provided in terms of supporting market prices or giving subsidies to reduce the cost of inputs, but also it could be per hectare, per animal, or just directly to top up farm incomes. Also, support might be given under the conditions of farmers actually engaged in production or not, or payments are conditional to respect specific production practices. These distinctions are very important as support delivered in these different ways have different impacts on agricultural production, trade, incomes, and also the environment. Now, in contrast, for example, to the price support measures, which are very blanket and not discriminating between beneficiaries, there are other support measures that they are more targeted to specific objectives. In the PSC methodology, what is important to know is that the classification of support measures into different categories is based on how policies are actually implemented and not on the objectives or impacts of those policies. For example, you will not find in the database category to say what are the support to rural development or to the environment. All of the information is on there, but the main criteria is how the policies are implemented. And the different categories we use there is whether, for example, the transfers, the payments are based on commodity output, on input, on area, on income, on historical elements, etc. In addition, of these main categories, we have a supplementary information and concerning implementation details. For example, to the extent to which whether there are payments and support which is subject to production limits, is subject to farming practices, or whether they are subject to to cross-compliance or animal welfare, etc. Therefore, the PSC classification of categories of policy measures, although based on implementation criteria, provides data for analyzing policy impact. It has the potential to show the degree of flexibility in production choice that farmers have and how different policies could influence farmers' decision to produce commodity and non-commodity outputs. Now, how farm support can be classified according to the potential environmental impact. The OECD work on monitoring and evaluation has shown that, in general, the more a policy measure provides incentives to increase the production of specific agricultural commodities, the greater is the incentive towards monoculture, intensification of production, and daily higher levels of fertilizer pesticides use, and subsequent adverse effects on the environment, soil quality, and biodiversity, or bringing marginal environmentally sensitive land into production, and the highest in general the pressures on the environment. On the other hand, the more policy measure can be targeted to specific environmental goal, the greater it will be the potential effectiveness in achieving this goal. Assuming that everything else is equal, market price support, output payments per output unit produced, and variable input subsidies like those that apply to fertilizers, pesticides, energy, water, etc., are potentially considered to be the most harmful for the environment because of the production itself they create. On the other hand, support that imposes environmental constraints on farming practices can be considered as being potentially the least harmful to the environment. This, for example, can include payments based on no commodity criteria or the number of payments which are linked to constraints or resource use and farm practices. Before I move to the empirical evidence, I have to highlight the caveats that the total PSC, the data and its compositions, or the composition of different categories, should not be interpreted as indicating the actual impact of policy on production, trade, on the environment. They only show the potential impacts. These indicators provide the necessary data and information to quantify the effects. The actual impacts depends on the many factors that determine the aggregate degree of responsiveness of farmers to policy changes, including this constraints of production. For the benefit of time, I will move to some results now. And here we see this is the producer support to farmers for a number of countries. As you can see here, overall, for all the countries included, the total amount is around 585 billion, of which 40%, 238 billion, is for OECD countries. So, and one characteristic we'll see that the support differs from country to country, but also has been decreasing due to various policy reforms over time. For example, in 2013-15, the percentage PSC is estimated to be 80%, which is about half of what it was used to be in the mid-80s. But as I said, this is this aggregate hide the country differences. For example, in countries like Norway, Switzerland, Japan, and Korea, and Iceland, the producer support as a percentage of farms received is more than 40%. That other countries like Australia, New Zealand, Chile is less than 3%. Another characteristics that might be worth mentioning here is that it's interesting to compare the trends of support between OECD and emerging economies. While you will see that here in OECD, the trend has been on average declining, for the emerging countries have passed from negative support, that means tax and agriculture, to provide significant levels of support that in most recent years has become to converse with OECD countries. Another characteristic, very important, is that the changes in the composition of support. while in the past, up to the mid-90s, for example, as much as 4/5 of support to producers was provided through market price support, now there is a shift towards budgetary payments. Only in 7 countries, still market price support is the most important. This includes Japan, Switzerland, Iceland, Israel, Korea, Norway, and Turkey. However, overall, the progress towards budgetary reform and towards less distortive reform is very slow from year to year. And finally, the last slide on the trends in the potentially environmental harmful producer support is that despite the progress towards more decoupled support, we see that still up to half of the total support according to agricultural producers can be classified as potentially the most environmentally harmful. This has been declined from 75% in 1995-97 to 50% now in 13-14. The other part of support that can be classified as the most potentially the least distorted has been increased, but still it's less than 10%, it's around 8%. As Katia said before, we calculated that in 2015 for OECD countries, therefore, about $104 billion can be potentially defined as environmentally harmful support to producers. I will stop here and I will pass to Roger. Thank you.
Many thanks, Dimitris and Katia. Just a call for Roger to be within the time frame of about 10 minutes in the presentation and no more, so we have still a few time for questions. Thank you for the interesting presentations.
Yeah, you bet. Thanks, everyone. Hang in there. We're almost done. Now, Dimitris pretty much laid out the basic idea about how we measure support in the OECD in terms of the way we classify and make the different categories and why we do that. So I'm just going to jump right into the data that we have for fisheries. We basically have a classification that follows very much what Dimitris was saying. We measure transfers to fishers as individuals, that in terms of policies that make payments to their costs of operation, to the income, to supplement their income or to reduce capacity. And there's also general transfers that benefit the sector as a whole, such as for infrastructure, for marketing, community support, and most importantly, management of resources. So the things that are interesting about fishing subsidies right now is the debate that's going on about which subsidies in fisheries affect desired fishing effort. And that's in terms of fishing capacity. When the fleet is larger than it would be otherwise, and this large fleet wants to go out and fish, there's lots of excess capacity. That tends to promote overfishing, both where fisheries are managed, but also it promotes illegal fishing. We call it IUU fishing, illegal, unreported, unregulated. The more excess capacity there is floating around globally, the more of this tends to get into trouble and start doing some of this IUU activity. And as well, policies that just directly provide incentives for fishers to fish more, to fish harder, to fish using ways that are more damaging to the environment. So those are the concerns that are being discussed right now in the context of the discussions about fisheries subsidies at the WTO and within the context of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, such as 14.6, which say that such subsidies should be gradually eliminated. So here's what the data looks like. We inventory about $7 billion worth of support in our database, as Katia pointed out. That doesn't include things like subsidies to fuel use. We have a separate estimation of that as in the OECD region being around $2 billion. So you can add that to the total if you wish in terms of total support directed to the sector. But what we see very clearly is in our data is most of the support is going to general services. A relatively small share is being transferred to fishers as individuals. And this is really the opposite situation of what Dimitris was just laying out in agriculture. So So support to fishers is mostly overall generalized support to the sector, with only about something less than 10% of it being transfers to individual fishers. And this is something that we see in our database has been generally declining over time, although the trend is not much in it. And our inventory is incomplete in a lot of ways, and I hesitate to draw too many conclusions about the trend over time for that reason. Now, we do see that, and this is a measure of how much of the support in percent is going towards management services overall. And we see for many countries the number is quite high. Part of the reason for the number being really high is that we just don't have good coverage in those countries, and so this is just the portion of their policies that we're capturing. But even taking that into account, we can be pretty confident that most of the budgetary money that governments are spending on fisheries sectors has to do with their management. Now, mostly this kind of support is considered to be benign, and that's the way it's been discussed internationally. But to our way of thinking at the OECD, it's not entirely sure that all this support can really be considered benign. The regulatory activity that's behind it is benign and is in fact very important. The efforts that governments make to regulate their fishing sectors in order to keep fishing levels at levels that are sustainable is of course critically important. But it's a bit of a question in our minds about who should be paying for the costs of delivering that. And we think that as a matter of principle, if you think about the polluter pays principle, this is one way to help fix this in your minds, is that the sector should really ideally be able to bear the costs of its own management. And when we see that the average amount of budgetary expenditure to support management and control and surveillance actions in fisheries, that usually amounts in OECD countries to around 30% of the value of landings. And so if you want to think about the gross contribution of the sector to society, 30% of that on average is immediately eaten up just in the costs of management. So we think, given the scale of that, there's scope for governments to consider how they could gradually ask their sectors to contribute more of these costs. And this will be an important check to make sure that fishing is an important and a net contributor to the economic well-being of nations. So the next thing I want to show you is there's a little bit of evidence in progress in terms of the way support is being delivered in the OECD region. We send, this is sort of a phase plane graph, if you will, showing the percentage change in the percentage of support that's GSSE and the percentage of support as transfers to individual fishers. It's measured as, and it's written there on the slide, the average annual change in the absolute contributions of TIF and GSSE to the total support. And we see that the predominant but not exclusive story is that support is moving away from transfers to individual fishers, as seen as a move to the left on the horizontal axis, and more towards going into GSSE. And that's, I think, hopeful in terms of progress. Now, and that's all I'm going to say about fisheries support at the moment. Here's a little summation about all the references you've heard mentioned in our presentation and some websites where you can visit to learn more about these things. I really do encourage you to come check out some of our databases. The Fisheries database in particular has just been updated for 2015. That's quite new. We also want to emphasize that this inventory that I've described, where we have about $7 billion in support, the value of that increases dramatically the more countries participate in it. So the more that we hear about support in countries, especially outside the OECD, the more we can contextualize what this means. Is support in the OECD region dramatically different or dramatically higher than outside the OECD region? The only way we can know that is by finding partners outside the OECD to go through this process and participate in our database and help us understand a bit better the global pattern and trends in support. So that's just a bit of a plea for help at the very end here, and I'll just thank the organizers and thank the listeners for their patience.
Thank you, everyone, for the very informative and rich presentations. I believe in the past and within the biodiversity finance initiatives, we had discussion more specific to the identification of what biodiversity harmful subsidies are and how it can be tracked. I think that the conversation today is instead on a very much importance on understanding the sectoral and larger trends that are related to the forms of those subsidies. This is much beyond the usual realm of biodiversity and conservation, and it reaches different constituencies, sector constituencies, and constituencies related to public finance and the management of public resources. Let me thank again the organizers, and now I open the floor for questions. You can